Okay. So I think we will begin since we have a full program. And we have 4 wonderful lectures lined up tonight in honor of Tu Bishvat from the Schechter Institute. I will be talking about an alternative approach to the Shemitah year, to the sabbatical year. Dr. Einat Ramon will be talking about the human and nature within us and around us in honor of Aleph Dalet Gordon's 100th Yahrzeit. And if you don't know who Gordon is, you'll soon find out. A very important labor Zionist thinker. Dr. Jeremy Benstein will be talking about the 4 Gilgulim or Reincarnations of Tu Bishvat, which is a wonderful historical survey of the holiday. And Dena Thaler will be talking about TALI and Ecology, how we teach sustainability in the TALI school system. So we have here both halacha, Jewish thought, some Jewish history and Jewish thought, and Jewish education. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my topic. And I'm going to share with you first one document, then the other. This is an ad that appeared in the Jerusalem Post on October 22nd. And it's a summary of the laws or the approaches to Shemitah according to the Rabbanut HaRashit Israel, the chief rabbinate of Israel. And it tells us that in their opinion, there are 4 ways of observing Shemitah in our day. And I'm not grading them, I'm just reading on my screen from right to left. Heter Mechira, in which the chief rabbinate of the state of Israel sells the land of Israel to a non-Jew for a period of 2 years to enable farmers, Jewish farmers, to do certain activities, agricultural activities during the Shemitah year, during the sabbatical year, which is this year. Another approach, produce from abroad, agricultural produce imported from outside the territory of the land of Israel. A third approach, products grown by non-Jews, which is to buy fruits and vegetables from non-Jewish farmers in the land of Israel. And the fourth approach, which is called Otzar Beit Din, which means that the Jewish farmers appoint the Beit Din, a Jewish court of law, as rabbinic court agents to sell their produce to consumers. And this is a this is a legal fiction to get around the challenges of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year in the state of Israel. When I first wrote my responsum on the subject of the Shemitah in Hebrew 35 years ago, I did not have a prior opinion. I certainly was not an expert in the halachot, the laws of Shemitah. What I knew was that none of these approaches were satisfactory, in my opinion. The 3 on the right rely on non-Jews in order to observe the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year in the land of Israel. And the one on the left relies on the Beit Din, but as we'll hear in a moment, it doesn't really solve most of the halachic problems involving the Shemitah year in the land of Israel. So now we're going to go back to the 2 main biblical sources in the Torah, and then we're going to briefly go through the responsum that I published on the subject, which is on the Schechter website. And Karen, I think, is also going to put the link in the chat so you can read it on your own later on. The 2 primary sources for Shemitah are, first of all, in Shmot, chapter 23. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. According to these 2 brief verses in the book of Exodus, there seem to be 2 purposes of the sabbatical year. One is to let the land lie fallow, to give the land a break during the Shemitah year. And the second is that the poor of your people shall eat. You remember, of course, they lived in an agricultural society. Most of the people were farmers. The poor people could simply enter your field during the Shemitah year and take whatever they wanted to eat. And interestingly enough, it also says that the wild beasts, Chayat HaSadeh, can eat as well. So these seem to be the two primary purposes of the Shemitah year, according to Exodus chapter 23. And the other verse or verses are found in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25. When you enter I'm not going to read it in Hebrew because we don't have time. When you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord, Shabbat Lashem. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. In the Hebrew, Shnat Shabbaton Yela Aretz. In modern Israel, if you say you're having a sabbatical, you say Yesh Li Shnat Shabbaton. That's where the expression comes from, a sabbatical year. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. This is a much longer way of saying the same two things we saw in the verses from Exodus, which is one, to give the land the Shabbaton, a rest, and two, that the slaves can eat from the fields, the laborers can eat from the field, the cattle from the field. In other words, the fields are now totally open and anyone or any animal can go in and take whatever it is they want. So these are the two primary biblical sources on the subject of the sabbatical year. Now I'm going to segue over to my responsum on the subject. Can you all see it? I'll make it bigger if I can. Thank you. How do I make it bigger? I don't see any plus signs. Oh, okay, over here. Okay, so this is the responsum that I originally published in Hebrew in 1985 and in English in the year 2007, which was a couple of Shemitah cycles ago. And here at the bottom of at the beginning of the responsum, I summarize the methods that were advertised in the ad that I showed you before. All of these methods assume that Shemitah in our day is not a biblical commandment, but a rabbinic commandment, not from the Torah, but from the rabbis. We'll see in a few moments why they say that. And one of the methods used, as we saw in the illustration from the chief rabbinate, was the Otsar Beit Din, rabbinic court agents. Interestingly enough, Dafka, the Chazon Ish, or Haredi Rabbi Yishayahu Karelitz, who died in 1953, he based this method on a single passage in rabbinic literature, which is found in Tosefta Shvi'it, volume 8. It's ironic that it's found, I'm quoting here from the Lieberman edition. For those of you who like esoterica, Professor Saul Lieberman was the first cousin of the Chazon Ish, of Rabbi Yishayahu Karelitz, though there was a 25-year age gap between them, both Talmudic geniuses. And in that passage in Tosefta, in the Lieberman edition, it talks about rabbinic court agents, in which the farmer is giving his produce to the Beit Din is selling it to the Jews, and it's a way of getting around some of the restrictions of the Shemitah year. The problem is that it can't really solve the problem of agriculture in the state of Israel, because produce distributed through the Otsar Beit Din retains the sanctity of Shemitah, Kedushat Shemitah, which means it may not be thrown in the garbage, it may not be eaten by non-Jews, food normally consumed by human beings cannot be fed to animals, it may not be sold, and it may not be exported abroad. Other than that, everything is hunky-dory. So the Otsar Beit Din method technically relies on Jews and not on non-Jews, but from a practical point of view, it really doesn't solve the problem of agriculture in the state of Israel. When I originally wrote this responsum, I also mentioned here that the Polei Agodat Yisrael Kibbutzim were supported by a Shemitah foundation. In other words, Jews from abroad gave them money during the Shemitah year, so they would not have to work their fields and rely on agriculture. Most Haredi Jews buy their produce during the Shemitah year from Arabs. And of course, if everyone in Israel did that, Israeli Jewish agriculture would collapse during the Shemitah year. Another way around the problem is that the borders of the land of Israel, according to rabbinic sources, are much smaller than the borders of the land of Israel today. For example, Eilat is not in the rabbinic land of Israel, and neither is most of the Negev and parts of the Upper Galilee. So some of the Jews who want to observe Shemitah buy the produce from those parts of the land of Israel today, from Medinat Yisrael, in order to get around the Shemitah prohibitions. And finally, the most widely accepted method, which is the Heter Mechira, which is symbolically selling the state of Israel, the land of Israel, to a non-Jew for a period of 2 years. This was the approach adopted by Rabbi Kook in the year 1911. He wrote an entire book on the subject. The book was not called the Kook Book, but rather it was called Shabbat Haaretz, the Shabbat of the land. I have it here on my shelf behind me, where I have about half a shelf full of books about the Shemitah year. And he was merely reinforcing or approving a method developed by Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Schechter in Kovno in Lithuania in the 1880s, when the first Chalutzim asked Rabbi Schechter, what should we do about the Shemitah year in places like Zichron Yaakov and all the other early Rishon LeZion and all the other early settlements in the land of Israel. And this enables Jewish farmers to do part of the agricultural labor they would normally do during the Shemitah year. And because the land technically now belongs to a non-Jew. What are the problems with all of these methods? I already mentioned that in brief, but now we can see it in greater detail. Regarding the Haredi solution, did we found the state of Israel so that Israeli Jews should be supported by diaspora Jews or buy their produce from Arabs during the sabbatical year? This solution fits the mindset of the ultra-Orthodox community that devised it. Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who was a famous modern Orthodox rabbi, who was born in Europe, was rabbi for many years in Skokie, and then made Aliyah, and I met him here in Jerusalem. He was vehemently opposed to the Heter Mechira, to selling the state of Israel to a non-Jew for the Shemitah year. And this is what he wrote: to refrain from tilling the land and to maintain the viability of one's economy through financial support, mainly from non-Shemitah observing diaspora Jewry, is a confession that in present conditions, the Shemitah law is not workable. Surely it could not have been the intention of the divine lawgiver that the majority of the Jewish people should live in the dispersion and the Sabbath of the land be observed through their charitable generosity. In other words, Rabbi Berkowitz says it's an absurd situation if we can only observe Shemitah in the land of Israel by A, tzedakah from abroad, and B, by buying our produce from non-Jews. And as I wrote here, Rav Kook's solution is even more surprising, since it originates precisely in the religious Zionist camp. It turns out that the ultra-Orthodox leave the land in Jewish hands, while the Zionists sell the land of Israel to Gentiles. It is faithful to the letter of the law, but not to its spirit. In order to observe the sabbatical laws in the land that I assign to you, which was one of the verses we just read, all the land, vegetation, plants, fruit trees, and all kinds of trees that we have in our holy land of Israel, that's what it says in the Shtar Mechira, in the sale document, is sold to an Arab dignitary for a period of 2 years. And Rabbi Berkowitz says even more objectionable is the solution of the chief rabbinate. Apart from the very questionable validity of the sale, is it not a self-demeaning procedure to sell the entire agricultural area of the Jewish people in the state of Israel to non-Jews every 7th year? But to sell the land of Israel every 7th year is a farce that we should have been spared. So wrote Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, a religious Zionist. This dissatisfaction was also expressed by other famous religious Zionist leaders over the course of many decades. I quote here from Meir Or, a religious Zionist leader from Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi. It is obviously distasteful to sell the land in Israel today in the state of Israel. It would be commendable if the sages of our generation were to use one of the other methods, such as hefker, a confiscation by a rabbinic court, is valid. Similarly, Tzuriel Admonit, a famous religious Zionist thinker, wrote back in 1960, a heter, permission based on selling all of the state of Israel's land, grates on the ears and is distasteful. There have been various suggestions to look for other ways. It is a pity we did not follow it. And finally, before we get to the halachic issues, there's an important passage in Rabbi Kook's book, Shabbat Haaretz, which is worth stressing. And Rabbi Kook used this argument as a snif leheter, as one of his arguments for allowing the heter mechira, the sale of the land of Israel. And this is what Rabbi Kook wrote 110 years ago. In ancient times, when the Jewish community in Israel was based primarily on tilling the land for food, the seventh year's holiness could be established according to the law without a heter, since in the end, all of the produce was left unclaimed in the fields, and this benefited the poor, and it was close to the Torah's intention, let the needy among your people eat of it. But in our days, when the Jewish community in Israel is based on selling the produce of the moshavot, and if this is prevented, their future livelihood and status will also be destroyed. In this situation, it is certainly an obligation to institute the heter mechira. In other words, Rabbi Kook is stressing here that one of the main two purposes, as we just saw in the verse from Exodus, is ve'achlu evyonei amecha. The poor of your people shall eat the produce from the field. And today, whether you follow the Haredim and buy produce from non-Jews, or whether you follow the chief rabbinate and sell the land of Israel to a non-Jew, you are not fulfilling that mitzvah. The poor are not coming into your field and helping themselves to whatever produce they want during the sabbatical year. So technically, they may be fulfilling the laws of Shemitah, but in terms of the substance and the purpose of the Shemitah year, va'achlu evyonei amecha, you shall feed the poor of your land, none of these methods approved by the chief rabbinate fulfill that desire or that obligation in any way. So what is the solution? What are our options? So now I'm going to skip down. And as I said, if you have time, you'll be able to read the entire responsum online yourselves. In the next section, which I don't have time to go through carefully, I show that even in the Talmudic period, in the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and the early Amoraim, such as Rabbi Yanai, they were very lenient regarding the laws of Shemitah. For example, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said that Caesarea is permitted, Beit Guvrin is permitted, Kfar Tzemach is permitted. In other words, he said that all sorts of specific cities that had large non-Jewish populations do not have to observe the Shemitah year. Another passage says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi tried to abolish the Shemitah year. And here at the bottom of the next page, the most famous example is that of Rabbi Yanai, Rabbi's pupil. As Rabbi Yanai proclaimed, go and sow during the Shemitah year because of Arnona. For those of you who live in Israel, you're probably laughing. Arnona is the property tax we pay through the nose in our various cities in Israel. That's not the original meaning of the word Arnona, which is Greek and Latin. Arnona was a percentage of the crops paid as a tax to the Romans. And Rabbi Yanai said, because of the Roman economic burden upon us, he actually told the Jews during the Shemitah year to go and sow. In other words, to plant their crops in a normal fashion during the Shemitah year because of the economic pressures created by the Roman government. Now, why were Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Yanai so lenient? This has to do with the way they viewed the Shemitah year. And there are three approaches among the halachic authorities stretching from the Talmudic period and down through the medieval period, the period of the Rishonim. The first approach says that Shemitah in our day is a biblical prohibition. In other words, we have to observe exactly what it says in those verses we just read in the Bible. You shall not work your land in any way, shape, or form during the Shemitah year. And there are a number of medieval halachic authorities who say that Shemitah in our day is still a biblical prohibition. However, and here I'll show you the paragraph, right? Here on page 10, Rabbi Yosef Karo derived this opinion from Maimonides, but apparently that's not correct. Nachmanides is one of the only Rishonim medieval halacha authorities who said that the prohibition in our day is biblical. Many Rishonim, many of the medieval halacha authorities, said that Shemitah in Talmudic times was a rabbinic prohibition. And they give a number of reasons for that. For example, if Shemitah in the Second Temple period was biblically ordained, then how did Hillel the Elder dare to make the famous Prusbul enactment, which goes around a biblical prohibition? So they follow Rabbi and say that Shemitah in our day is a rabbinic prohibition, and that is a common approach among the Rishon. However, the next approach is the most interesting one. And this is item C on the page in front of you. Many Rishonim maintained, like the Ravad is a famous rabbi in Posquier in Provence, in southern France. He lived in the 12th century. And Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, that when Rabbi Judah the Prince ruled that Shemitah was rabbinic, he was referring to the Second Temple period and his own time, but not to the Middle Ages. In other words, after the destruction of the temple, there was still a supreme rabbinic court that maintained a reminder of the Jubilee year, that blew the shofar, released the slaves, returned inherited lands to their original owners. During that period of time, which included the time of Rebbe, Shemitah and the Jubilee year were rabbinically ordained. But later, when the Jubilee year was annulled entirely, Shemitah was also annulled entirely, and today, meaning in the Middle Ages, both agricultural Shemitah and monetary Shemitah are midat chasidut, acts of piety, and no more. Now, this is something that you will find only tangentially in most of the Orthodox responsa that have been written on this topic. In other words, they do quote the opinion that a few rabbis say that Shemitah in our day is midat chasidut, an act of piety, but they quote it as a minority opinion. And indeed, Rabbi Cook says this is a snif leheter. This is an extra reason why we can follow his method of selling the land to non-Jews, because one rabbi, Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, said in the 11th, 12th century, said that Shemitah in our day is only an act of piety. However, and this I think was the primary chidush or innovation of my responsum, we know today that Rabbi Zerachia's opinion was never an individual opinion. Rabbi Kasher, and for those of you who study Jewish studies, you've heard of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher, the author of Torah Shlema, which is a 40-volume work sitting on my shelf over here. You can now buy it in a database as well. Rabbi Kasher was one of those people who knew, like Rabbi Lieberman, all of rabbinic literature by heart. And he published 3 fascinating articles that show that many rabbis in Provence and elsewhere considered Shemitah in our day an act of piety. In addition to Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, the Ravad, and the Ran, this opinion is mentioned by the following rabbis: by Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe of Vienna, who lived in Vienna in the 13th century, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Abamari, who lived in Provence in the 12th century, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, who died in Provence in the year 1315, Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon Duran, who died in North Africa in the 15th century, and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, the Meiri testifies, remember this is around the year 1300, that many of the Geonim and rabbis who are with us agree with him that Shemitah in our day is only an act of piety. And the Rashbash, that's North Africa, 15th century, also testifies that many important authorities consider it does not apply today, even rabbinically. On this basis, Rabbi Kasher summarizes as follows. If so, the question of agricultural Shemitah in our day takes on a totally different form, since it is not a question of an individual versus many as we thought, but rather it is many versus many who actually observe this way in practice. And he adds, there is a large group among the early sages who considered that monetary Shemitah and agricultural Shemitah are one and the same, and neither of them applies in our day, not even rabbinically, but only as a midat chasidut, as an act of piety. And what I did after reading Rabbi Kasher's articles is I actually counted the Rishonim, the medieval halachic authorities who discussed this topic, and it turns out the majority felt that Shemitah in our day is a midat chasidut, is an act of piety. It is not a biblical prohibition. It is not a rabbinic prohibition. It is an act of piety, and it is up to every farmer and every Jew to determine whether they want to observe these laws or not. And therefore, I summarize the subject as follows. If possible, the following laws should be observed. Sowing the winter crop before Rosh Hashanah, so you don't actually have to sow during the Shemitah year. Sowing grass and ornamental trees for gardens before Rosh Hashanah. Whenever possible, avoid biblically forbidden work, such as sowing, pruning, harvesting, and plowing, or do them in a different manner. Avoiding the planting or tending of ornamental gardens if they are not essential for preventing erosion during the rainy seasons, such as the rainstorm going on in Israel for the past 3 days. And finally, to perform various symbolic and educational acts to enhance the awareness of the Shemitah year. Number 1, planning the agricultural cycle to fit the 6 years between the 2 Shemitah years. Number 2, leave one field with a large sign as the Shemitah corner. In other words, one field should be left fallow during the Shemitah year with a sign saying this is the field that is observing the original laws of Shemitah as found in the Torah. Number 3, hold public study sessions of the laws of Shemitah in the Mishnah, Maimonides, and other sources. But the most important thing is the last thing, number 4. In the final analysis, what is the purpose of Shemitah? As it is written that the poor of thy people may eat. Today, almost no one fulfills the commandment's purpose as it appears in the Torah. Therefore, the religious kibbutzim started a special fund a few Shmitot ago in order to donate some of the Shemitah year's profits to the poor. It would be most appropriate if all Jewish farmers in Israel should donate a percentage or a fixed amount of the Shemitah year's profits to poor people. In this way, the original purpose of Shemitah will be achieved. It would be nice if we could observe the biblical laws of Shemitah and actually allow our lands to lie fallow for a full year. However, given the modern agricultural economy of the state of Israel, in which most of the crops are grown for export, the result of doing that would be to destroy the agricultural work of the farmers in the state of Israel. And therefore, I believe that the best approach of all the approaches that I outlined in this brief lecture is the approach of Midat Chasidut, which was the majority opinion of the Rishonim, of the medieval halachic authorities, that Shemitah in our day is not a biblical prohibition, it is not a rabbinic prohibition, it is an act of piety. If you can do it, if you are able financially to survive as a farmer, fantastic. But if not, there is much room in Jewish law to allow you to continue to do the things you need to do in order to survive economically and agriculturally. And finally, to set aside one field as the Shemitah corner and to give a certain percentage of your crops or your profits to the poor during the Shemitah year. I believe that in this way, even though we may not be able to fulfill the exact commandment of letting the land lie fallow during the Shemitah year, we can fulfill the mitzvah of Achlu Avyonei Amecha, that the poor of your people shall be able to eat during the sabbatical year. This is a brief summary of a very long responsum. I hope that you will go to our website and read the responsum. Karen, I assume that Karen, are you here somewhere? I assume that Karen put the link.
Yes, I've posted the link
Okay.
in the chat, and I see someone asked. The link is above.
Okay, so the link is in the chat, and please feel free to read the entire responsum in English. And those of you who wish to read it in Hebrew, it's at the Schechter website, responsafortoday.com. And I'm sure while we are talking, Karen will find that as well. responsafortoday.com under Responsa Davad Halacha Volume 1. So you can read it in English or in Hebrew. And if you have any questions after reading the Responsa in depth, please feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the wand to Dr. Einat Ramon. Dr. Ramon has been teaching at Schechter for many, many years. She is the founder of our Marpei CPE Hospital Chaplaincy Program since 2007, and really has been one of the key people getting hospital chaplaincy CPE recognized as a profession in the state of Israel. And one of her areas of expertise upon which she wrote her doctorate is the writings of Aleph Dalet Gordon, who was a very famous labor Zionist thinker and kibbutznik 100 years ago. And in honor of his 100th Yahrzeit, Dr. Ramon is going to share some of his thoughts on the subject of the human and nature within us and around us in honor of Tu Bishvat. Einat, bevakasha.
Thank you, David. Actually, chaplaincy at Schechter is not only hospital chaplaincy, but also we train at old age homes and we train at schools and we work with soldiers. And in many ways, I think maybe we will be able to connect that later. The role model or one of the role models for Israeli chaplains or spiritual caregivers is Aleph Dalet Gordon, who was a kind of spiritual caregiver for the secular pioneers. And I'll start a little bit to speak about his biography and we'll touch a little bit his spiritual caregiving to the pioneers. And then we will primarily discuss his thought that evolves around the term nature, and what that term means in his thought is quite complicated and interesting. We'll see. I'm going to leave some time for discussion at the end of my presentation, so that will give us a little more of an informal give and take conversation concerning Gordon. So Aleph Dalet Gordon, let me begin by today. Today, there is a sense of revival of interest in Aleph Dalet Gordon's thought. For many years, there has not been. And the reason is that he was associated with a term which he never coined, but was somehow attached to him, a religion of labor, that Zionism means coming to Israel, toiling the land, and that toiling the land is a substitute of our religion. In many ways, some of the pioneers, the secular pioneers that came in the second and third aliyot, that is from 1904 until the British Mandate, 1904 until 1917, that second aliyah, and then 1917 until 1924-ish is third aliyah. These were the two secular socialist aliyot and immigrations, and they were very much influenced by ideas and modes of living of communism, socialism, communes that were established in Russia at that time. And Gordon, for reasons that are quite interesting, he was actually anti-socialist and anti-communist, decided in 1904 to live with these pioneers and be part of the founding of the kibbutzim movement and the moshavim. That was not a very natural thing for him to do because he was 48 when he came to Israel in 1904, and he died in 1922 when he was 68. So he was considered to be the old man. I mean, today many of us have passed that age and would not allow to be called old people. But at this time, people did not live so long. And also the chalutzim, the pioneers, they were 18 years old and 20 years old, and the oldest among them were 30 years old. So for him to live with them was kind of an unnatural thing to do. It's like that's something that would be bizarre if we today went and lived in communes of 18 years old and 19 years old. I mean, that was an ideological decision that we will touch in a second. But at the same time that Gordon was not pro-socialist and pro-communist, he was very sensitive to issues that they spoke for, that these groups upheld. One of them was fair conditions for laborers. That was something that was really important to him. There are memoirs that he would just get up and leave the vineyard or the other factories if people did not treat a worker properly. And he would just not have a job afterwards. So he was very sensitive to these issues of workers' solidarity and care for each other. And he lived from 1904 on, he moved from one settlement of laborers to another. So he did not stay in one place for too long of a time. And in each one of these laborers' settlements, he would be a kind of, as I said, spiritual supporter for these people. They would come and pour their heart to him. Many of them had tremendous bouts of loneliness and depression. I mean, we kind of tend to look at the pioneers, look up to them and say, look, they've founded the state, they founded the country. Yes, they did. But the price that individuals have paid was very high. They've left their families and never have seen them again. Many of them grew up in religious home and were secularized by the process of becoming Zionists. And they didn't really have clear patterns of life that are outside of halakha. So many of the women remained single for a long time because the whole relationship between men and women was not clear. Now that they're not living in an Orthodox life and there is no matchmaking and there aren't any clear rules as to the relationship between men and women and what should it look like. They've struggled with that issue as well. And the other issues that they've struggled generally with the question of Judaism. What is the role of Judaism in their lives? I mean, if many of them became secular, are they going to have a holiday? Are they going to have a Sabbath? Are they going to have anything that they grew up with? Now, not all of these pioneers grew up in religious homes, but some of them did. And for them, Gordon was this kind of father figure. He was also the age of their parents, whom they've left and they've not seen. You know, many of them have left their families and never saw them again. For some of them, by the way, their parents, their religious parents or traditional parents came and followed them. Some of the families in Degania, they had their parents come and join them. But many of them just left and never saw their families anymore. And so the feelings of loneliness, and also it's important to remember that in those years, it was not at all clear whether there's going to be a state here, whether there's going to be anything Jewish here. It was the time of the Ottoman Empire. The empire was falling apart. The British conquered. Was it good that the British conquered? Was it not good? What's going to happen? By the way, they thought they're coming here to escape the Ukrainian and the Russian and the Galician anti-Semitism, and they found here a new conflict between Jews and Arabs. So what should be the relationship with the Arabs? And Gordon was this kind of Jew who was able to bridge the world between the old world and the new world. There was able to bridge values, I want to say, between the old world and the new world. In what sense? He was an observant Jew. He kept Shabbat according to Jewish halakha, but he did not necessarily pray every day. I mean, he did pray in the beginning and then he stopped praying, but he was really very strict about observing Shabbat. And when they wanted, and he would do Kiddush every Shabbat. Some of them would join. When one of their friends got killed, So what do you do with the funeral? So Gordon would say the Kaddish near the grave of this kid that got killed. So Gordon was this kind of a bridge between the old world and the new world. He kind of maintained a sense of a Hamish feeling for them when they've felt kind of homeless in the land of Israel. And he was also very clear about the fact that they are building, that they have a future, that what they're doing is prophetic, that everything that they do is kind of, he would say this to them when they would cook at night in these settlements, and that every act that they do is creating the Jewish revival that is yet to come. And for them, this was kind of a spiritual support, because they were at times not even clear that the Jewish people are behind them. I mean, it's a kind of thing that we cannot imagine now that we have a state and we have millions of Jews living here. What does it mean for 1,000 people, the 5,000 pioneers among 30,000 people who made Aliyah between 1904 and 1917? So that they really were a fraction, but they were the ones who have settled the Galilee and the Jezreel Valley and all of these remote places. And they were secular, and they had kind of their struggle between secularism and religiosity. And Gordon was the spiritual leader, in the sense that he was able to give them the spiritual understanding of what it is that they're doing. So there are so many memoirs of them writing about him, how he used to support them here and used to support them there. And if somebody was very ill, Gordon would come and support that person and bring a letter from the lover to that person and joke with them, how he would sing on the Sabbath Eve, how he would conduct the Seder for them. But they never read his theology, his works. And between 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning, Gordon every night would turn up his lamp and write in small pencils philosophy written in the land of Israel, which tries to, I think, explain for himself what it is that, how to bridge the gap between the secular reality and the religious traditional world. Actually, my scholarship right now, I'm researching his connections with the Rav Kook, and it turns out that there were connections. I found some letters, and not letters, but I found evidence that the Rav Kook's son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, indicated that they had a relationship, Gordon and Rav Kook. And it doesn't make, it's not a big surprise, because I think the two of them tried to bridge the gap between the secular and the religious in their own lives, and in how to pull together these different fractions of the Jewish people. And so today there is a great revival. I just didn't mention the dates. Gordon was born in 1856 in the Ukraine area, and he died, as I said, in 1922 in Degania. He had 7 children, out of which 5 had died in child mortality in Eastern Europe was very common, and they died when they were little children. And 2 of them survived, a daughter and a son, but neither one of them had married. So he had no grandchildren. His daughter came to Israel, followed him and came to Israel, and she basically lived sometimes near him, sometimes not near him. His son stayed in Eastern Europe, and right after World War I died of typhoid. And his wife came to Israel in 1909 and died 4 months after she came to Israel. So really a tragic, tragic life. And you kind of think this person who was hit with so many tragedies in his life was a source of hope for the pioneers. But I think this is really such a Jewish thing, that no matter how many trials you undergo, you keep up the hope, you keep up faith, you keep up the path of the Jewish people. And that's really what Gordon tried to convey. And so in that context, I want to teach you a few texts to which I've referred in my dissertation that was written at Stanford. It was actually a very interesting thing to write a dissertation on A.D. Gordon at Stanford, because he was then less known than he is now. I told you that today there is a thriving of Gordon's, thriving may be an exaggerated word, but there is a emerging interest in Gordon's thought.
A revival.
What?
A revival.
Yeah, maybe revival is too strong of a word, but there is definitely an interest. And the reason there is an interest is because Gordon's work is very spiritual. And when people are looking for spirituality that is not necessarily associated with halachic life, with mitzvot, with Jewish religious life, Gordon is there, even though he was observant and he had very strong connections to the Jewish tradition. And he, here and there, he would daven at a synagogue. And he, as I told you, he made kiddush for the pioneers. He made the seder for the pioneers. He was kind of the address for Jewish life. At the same time, he was not associated with any religious establishment. And so today, when Israeli Jews are looking for thought that is not associated with the rabbinate or with the Orthodox or with the ultra-Orthodox, or with any religious establishment for that matter, not even Reform. So Gordon is really the address to look into that. This is a Jewish enough thought, and yet it is not clearly halachic. Although Gordon was not against halacha, but he was not living a fully halachic life. And I think there, Israeli Jews are finding, both people who grew up in the Orthodox world and people who grew up in the secular world, are finding a voice to which they can relate. And that voice is a voice that emphasizes a lot the role of nature and the role of the individual person searching for his or her connection with nature. But here is a traditional link through one's family, through one's tradition, and through one's people. For Gordon, Jewish peoplehood was a very, very important element in his thought. And you did not, according to Gordon, connect to Judaism because this is a religion or because it really has any dogmas, but because this is the spirituality of our nation. And so where does nature? First of all, I do want you to see that in that sense, Gordon was, we will go back to these passages later. Gordon chose to live in all of these agricultural pioneer communities. But I would say that he was really one of the first Jewish environmentalists that, he died in 1922. The fact that he was aware that our coexistence with nature, with the physical, natural environment that is around us is important for our living, that it is essential that we will have connection to the landscape. I will mention in a second why the landscape was so important to the landscape of our nation, that we will have responsibility to keep that landscape, to keep it, as it is, not to destroy it. And so this is a very famous passage that many Israelis read for Tu Bishvat that comes from Gordon. And I'm reading to you. How did the human being act vis-a-vis nature from the moment that he began to treat nature as his own? And here Gordon is very critical of kind of an aggressive, utilitarian attitude towards nature that humans have towards nature. That there is lacking a sense of modesty, of a kind of a gentle feeling, gentle behavior with nature. Is there in reality a spiritual relationship to the plant, to the field, to the garden, and to the forest as they are? Isn't there a movement for deforestation of entire forests, even eternal forests that are not only the magnificence of nature, but also sketches of the nobility and divine inspiration on nature? And so you see that for Gordon, there is a connection between the infinite nature and the divine, as it is in Judaism. Melo kol haaretz kvodo, that God fulfills the entire nature, the entire land. But what I want to say, where it is different from traditional theology, is that in traditional theology there is a sense of the divine which is supernatural, and here it is not clear. Gordon is not like Mordechai Kaplan, that there is no supernatural, everything is in nature. He's not like Spinoza, he's not like Kaplan in that sense, if you know Mordechai Kaplan and Spinoza's theologies. But he is very careful when he speaks about the supernatural, about that which is ultimate. He's very careful. And a question that I ask as a scholar that works with Gordon's text and tries to explore it is, was that his own view of God, or did he write in that language because he thought that that language would be accepted by his secular readers? That if he spoke about, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the divine God, which is the creator, that would alienate his readers. So I don't know whether it's both or it's just him, but this is Gordon's writing about the divine inspiration. We can also say that Gordon was very influenced, and that is, 100% true, by Maimonides' concept of God, which is very abstract. And so maybe we could say that there is a Maimonidean influence here. But Arthur Hertzberg, who was a scholar of Zionist thought, says that Gordon was Zionism's mystic. So Gordon's language is very, very mystical. We could not necessarily say that about Maimonides, but there is a sense of enchantment that the divine is, the divine sketches of nobility are found in nature. These forests are also essential for the health of both humans and plants. Don't we destroy them for the sake of money as a result of our limited and narrow calculations? Even the most decent governments do not regulate such actions. This is all an outcome of short-mindedness and not an account of nature. Okay, so here is Gordon very clearly writes as kind of an Emersonian environmentalist. How is it that we destroy nature, that nature is has the imprint of God? There is really a mystical awe in looking at nature, but now we can see that there is another reason why nature is so important to us and preserving the landscape. Where is the biblical forest of Lebanon? And I think in that question relies another element of why is it that we really should keep nature. Oh, this is skipping. The reason is that for Gordon, the landscape is also the memoir. It also preserves for us the landscape of our forefathers and foremothers. They saw the forest of Lebanon. Therefore, we should see the forest of Lebanon because there is continuity, because our connection to the Bible is through these landscapes, because the Bible preserved our connection to the landscapes. We are actually coming back to the land of Israel because of the Bible, and the Bible described a certain landscape. And so there is something about the existential need of the human being for a continuity in the landscape that that his parents saw or his grandparents saw, or some kind of a recollection of an ancient landscape that we would see now. And I think actually this is also an outcry, because the land, when Gordon came to Israel, was not very forested because of all the wars that it underwent and the conquering of each empire. Actually, a lot of the forestation was done by the Jewish National Fund, but the feeling that here we came to see the biblical forest of Lebanon, and where is it? Now he goes to a more kind of a philosophical, universal question.
Einat, יש רק עוד כמה דקות, בסדר?
Yeah, a waterfall that becomes a power engine. What does it say? And so on. Do not respond to these questions by blaming it on capitalism. This destruction of nature has existed since the dawn of civilization. A social revolution adds nothing in this regard. In a different social order, he relates here to socialism, you may find a more just distribution of material natural resources, yet the path to different relationship with nature is still very long. And so we see here that Gordon is really striving for a kind of spiritual relationship with nature, but it's kind of, aside from the things that I've just said, what kind of a relationship is he striving for? And there are many passages, but I also wanted to show you one thing that really speaks to me personally very much. And as I search for this on page 151, I'm willing to take some questions or comments, or whoever would like to make any remark. If not, I will continue to talk because I have a lot to say.
ויש רק עוד 3 דקות.
Okay, so on page 151, we see that Gordon is really looking for for nature as a kind of a pattern in which each creature has his or her own role, and that it is almost, from his point of view, a non-competitive relationship. And why is it really so important to Gordon? Because I think during these years, there is a Darwinian concept of nature, that nature is that the stronger controls, the strongest controls the weakest, that there is a hierarchy where each one, where the strongest person, the strongest creature survives and thus controls the weaker ones. And from Gordon's point of view, this is not what nature is all about. From Gordon's point of view, this is a kind of a more harmonious relationship where each one grows to be each creature grows according to his or her own abilities, and there is harmony between all these different abilities. And with that, I will finish. A truly great person is a person whose growth has no measure, who continuously grows, who is greater today than he was yesterday, and tomorrow will be even greater than he is today. Whoever causes others to overcome themselves and grow internally is seeking others the same inspiration for his own growth, personal growth. And the example that he brings is that an insect has his own role in life, and a small animal has her own role in life, and they don't really are competing with each other because nature needs all these creatures. And from his point of view, humans should learn that. Of course, this also corresponds with many Hasidic teachings, that each human being is important, that each human being has a role in life. And for him, this is another way that we approach nature, is that we look at nature and we think what kind of good moral lessons we are learning from nature. And from his point of view, the lessons that we learn are lessons of caring, are lessons of growing according to our role and our ability, not controlling or exterminating those who are so to speak, underneath us or dependent on us. And so we could say that this is a very romantic view of nature, but I would say this is a very interesting Jewish view of nature, because this really, according to Kabbalah, and also some of the halachic, each human being has his role and his own personal imprint of God that is in him, and that's already goes back to the Mishnah.
Right. Thank you very much. As the Mishnah said, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for me the world was created.
Exactly.
And that first passage you read was really way before its time in terms of environmentalism. So it's very appropriate for Tu Bishvat. And Einat, I think you also published a book about Gordon in Hebrew.
Yes, I published a book in Hebrew about Gordon, and just recently I'm publishing passages from Gordon for discussion and learning. And hopefully I'll also publish some.
So maybe in the chat you can write the name of your book in Hebrew so that those who want
in Hebrew. Okay. So
Daraba Einat, Yishar Kochech. And now we segue over to our third brief lecture, which is really on the subject of Tu Bishvat itself. And when I thought of arranging this Zoom session, one of the first people I thought about was Dr. Jeremy Benstein, who is, first of all, a graduate of the Schechter MA program. He was one of the few students who did an MA thesis at Schechter. Most of them did the MA Klali, but he did an MA with a thesis. I'm one of the few people in the world who has a copy of Dr. Jeremy Benstein's MA thesis, for the simple reason that I was his advisor. And the thesis is called Amirat Emet V'Sheker B'Re'is Sifrut Chazal, telling the truth and lying in rabbinic literature. And later on, he did a PhD in environmental anthropology from Hebrew University, which later on led to his book, The Way into Judaism and the Environment, published by Jewish Lights Publishing in 2006. Dr. Benstein is one of the founders of the Heschel Center for Sustainability in Tel Aviv, and he is now the English editor of the 929 website for those who are going through the Tanakh every 3.5 years. I know they're finishing a cycle soon in the month of February. For those of you who want to catch up, they're in Divrei Yamim. So without further ado, Dr. Benstein, bevakasha.
Thank you very much, and Erev Tov, good evening. It's an honor to be part of this very august forum, and I have to say, I think what I'm about to speak about really follows on develops very nicely from Rabbi Einat's words from Aleph Dalet Gordon. I'm going to have a little presentation that I put together for everybody here. So let me just, okay. Previously it was said that my presentation is historical, but I have to say that even though I'm going to talk about things that happened in history, I think it's actually quite actuali, as we say in Hebrew, actual, and not just of historical interest. And we'll start, like every good conversation, with the weather. We were talking before how cold it is abroad, and it's pretty crazy cold here as well. And so it just seemed, it always struck me as kind of, I don't know, paradoxical, or maybe it's just specifically Jewish, that we have our nature festival in like the dead of winter. And why did that ever happen? And so that's part of what I'm going to try to explain, okay? So I call this the 4 Gilgulim, or incarnations of Tu Bishvat. And I think that they can teach us a lot, and not only about the world, but also about a spiritual and cultural renewal in Judaism and Jewish tradition. So we'll start with the first Gilgul. Okay, and I'm sure many of you, if you've ever had anything to do with Tu Bishvat, then you know that it is indeed the New Year of the Trees. We say Rosh Hashanah Ilanot, but you may not be aware that this doesn't exist at all in the Tanakh, of course, but it first mentioned in the Mishnah. It's actually the very first chapter, the very first Mishnah of the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, because there are several kinds of New Years, and I won't go into that. That's actually an interesting story, and there are colleagues of mine who are environmentalists who are trying to who breathe new life into the idea of the new year for the animals, so we can get them on the map as well, along with the trees. But we'll stick with Tu Bishvat. And interestingly, there are 3 other New Years, like the New Year that we know, Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei, that are all on the first of the month. But here there's a machloket, there's a dispute about whether the New Year for the tree should be on the first of the month of Shvat or in the middle of it at the full moon, the 15th of Shvat. And so, of course, halacha kebeit Hillel, the halacha is according to Hillel that it is the 15th of Shvat. And the reason why the difference of the dates is actually, there's an interesting backstory of whether who was from which area in Israel and where how much rain fell where, because it has to do with the rain falling, because the idea of a new year for the trees is sort of like what I call Tu B'April for Americans, because it is both, it's like the end of the financial year for the trees, but it's also the day of payment for tithes. So all the fruit that became ripe before Tu Bishvat was tithed in the previous year, and the fruit that would come ripe after Tu Bishvat would be tithed in the following year. So it's about taxes, okay? And in that respect, I give each of these Gilgulim, each of these periods or incarnations of the holiday a sort of a typology. And so this type of Tu Bishvat, the Mishnaic halachic Tu Bishvat, is it's economic at its core. It's about nature as the source of physical sustenance, and because it's about paying taxes or paying tithes, it's about not only supporting the priests and the Levites in the temple, but also the poor, a way of distributing the divine shefa, as it were, the abundance that comes to us through the fruit crops. Now, what do you do with a holiday like this after the destruction of the temple, where there are no tithes to be paid to priests and Levites, and to the exile from the land, where we don't even have trees that we can call our own? So the holiday sort of became like a tree. It became dormant. It went into a long winter where there were some poems and piyutim that were written, but it didn't really have any manifestation as such until it's the first revival, as it were, which was the Kabbalists in Tzfat and their students. I'm going to read some text here from a composition known as Pri Eitz Hadar, which you can find on Sefaria or the Open Siddur Project. This is a translation. It is good to eat many fruits on this day and to celebrate them with praise. It is a wondrous tikkun on both exoteric, the nigla and the nistar, and esoteric levels. One should intend through eating the fruit to correct the sin that Adam committed with the fruit of the tree. Please God, who makes forms, creates, and emanates supernal worlds, and created their likeness on the earth below, on this day concerning the trees, budding and renewal. For so the days of budding will be full for the fruit of the supernal tree, meaning the heavenly, divine one, right? The tree of life, which is in the midst of the garden, and it makes fruit above, okay? So you can already see that the Kabbalists were not talking about any economic side of trees or nature or anything to do with tithes or taxes. They were using trees and nature in general as a spiritual metaphor, as a source of kind of a spiritual images and ideas, right? That there's this idea of the tree of the Sfirot, the divine emanations, which is sort of like a blueprint for the creation of the world and a map of the mind of God. And those 4 words that are underlined in that text there, which are Bria, Asiya, Yetzirah, and Atzilut, are for the 4 worlds, the physical, emotional, spiritual worlds that are noted in the Kabbalistic Seder Tu Bishvat, and the fruits are eaten according to symbolism that connects to those worlds. And just to finish that up with another prayer from the Pri Eitz Hadar, may it be your will that through the sacred power of our eating and blessing fruit, while reflecting on the secret of their supernal roots, their supernal sap will be aroused, so that shefa, favor, blessing, and bounty be bestowed upon them. And may all the holy sparks which were dispersed by us and through the sin that Adam committed with the fruit of the tree return to be included in the splendid power of the tree of life. I mean, it's gorgeous spiritual language. But I want to note two things. First of all, this already takes us into a whole different dimension of nature, that nature is the source of meaning and symbolism and a connection to things divine. And it's also something that they invented out of whole cloth, okay? If we're talking about the legitimacy of innovation in Jewish tradition and stuff, they just sat down and, I mean, they used obviously the Seder Pesach as a model, but there was never any precedent for doing this to Tu Bishvat. So it was an amazing example of religious creativity. Okay, and it was observed sort of sporadically both in Sfarad and Ashkenaz, but there was definitely a tradition of eating fruits, especially if possible from the land of Israel. And if you grew up where I did in the American Middle West, then that was probably your first and maybe your only encounter with buxer, the tough carob fruit that was symbolic of this holiday, which wasn't nearly as fun as it is over here in this country. Okay, so that was Gilgul number 2. Gilgul number 3 was several hundred years later. And this is one that's obviously very familiar to all of us, both here and in the Jewish world, around the world, the Zionist day of Nitiot, of tree planting. Here's a photo from 1912, and here I can take great local pride. I'm broadcasting to you from Zichron Yaakov, and the origin of planting trees on Tu Bishvat occurred right here. Rabbi Zev Yavetz of the first Aliyah in the new Yishuv, he decided to take his students out to plant trees and explained, for the love of the saplings, the school must make a festival of the day that was set aside from ancient times in Israel as the New Year of the trees, to arrange the trees, the saplings, and the lilies and the flowers gracefully, just like they do in Europe on the 1st of May. So interesting imitation of other things that he was familiar with, but it wasn't too long where this was adopted by the teachers' unions and by the Karen Kayemet, and indeed, Tu Bishvat became a day of planting. And just like the Seder of the Mekubalim, of the mystics, this too was invented out of whole cloth. There was never any sense that Dafka on Tu Bishvat in the middle of the winter would be a day that we should go out and plant trees. For some trees it works, for others probably better to plant in different seasons, but that doesn't matter because it is the day of planting. And so this gives us kind of a third dimension of nature. And I'm reminded of the phrase of the poet Chernyakhovsky, Adam hu tavnit nof moladeto, that a person is a reflection or a replica of the landscape of their homeland. And there's definitely a collective or identity side to our connection with nature. It's the source of memories, of identity, of connections, and things like that. And that is indeed what the Nitiot can symbolize. And I don't want to get political at all, but because there is a national expression to this, this is also something that's been controversial. And unfortunately, trees have from early on, but also just these past days and weeks, tree planting has become a political pawn in the national struggles over this land, where aggressive plantings and uprootings, which take place, it has to be said on both sides. So that only serves to reinforce how viscerally important this idea of our connection to the land through trees. Okay, so that is Gilgul number 3. Gilgul number 4, and this may be the one that we are that is maybe uppermost in our minds when we think of how synagogues and congregations and communities use Tu Bishvat in our day. It has become essentially the Jewish Earth Day, right? A day to talk about our connection to nature overall, our connection to taking care of nature, to preserving nature. And so while it is indeed a day of celebration, as opposed to maybe the 3 previous Gilgulim, this, I can say, sort of has a shadow of crisis, or at least of challenges around it, because there are so many threats to the natural world in our own day. And while this particular text that I chose here is not necessarily connected to Tu Bishvat specifically, it is an oft quoted, but still quite powerful text about taking us back to that original Garden of Eden, the garden, the paradise that was mentioned by the Mekubalim as well, where God took the first Adam and said, look at my works, see how beautiful they are, how excellent. For your sake, I created them all. Many environmentalists do not like that sentence. It's very anthropocentric, but let's continue on. It says, see to it that you do not spoil or destroy my world, right? It's not our world, even though we have a special place in it. It is indeed even if you don't have a faith in a personal creator, this world is something other than ours. So do not spoil or destroy my world. For if you do, there will be no one to repair it after you. The ultimate responsibility of stewardship, etc. And so this I call the fourth Gilgul. And again, these are not, each Gilgul did not replace the previous ones. These are like almost geological strata, one on top of the other, that can form an integrated whole. That's what I'll talk about in a second. And I just wanted to point out this poster here, and also to some insights that I got from Shoshana Michael Zucker from Kilat Hod V'Hadar here in Israel, who did some research on this. Everybody, including R.A. Alon and others, talk about this fourth Gilgul as being very American, right? It started in North America with all those Jewish environmentalists. But in fact, the first framing of Tu Bishvat as a day, or the month of Shvat as a time for thinking about nature preservation, actually occurred here in Israel through the Society for the Protection of Nature, the Chevra L'Haganat HaTeva. This is a poster from 1968. And so it definitely was an idea whose time had come, because it started sprouting, to use a tree metaphor, both here and there, both in both communities. So here, the ecological is the idea that nature is it's universal. In addition to being particular, it's the web of life that we're all a part of, and that we need to pay so much more attention to its preservation. I was just, in order to help publicize this event, I was just interviewed on the radio, and I was at 103 FM. If you're here in Israel, the show will be broadcast at 8 o'clock, right after I finished. Oh, no, I guess it's being broadcast right now. Anyway, but I was asked, well, what kinds of, if Tu Bishvat is a day of tree planting, so we know what we do. We go out and plant trees. What do we do if Tu Bishvat, what are the practicalities of the Chag, of the observance, if we frame it as a day of ecology? And so there are, of course, many things one can do to connect with nature, celebrate nature, etc. But I said, you don't even have to go very far from the tree plantings. One of the big ecological threats in the world, both threat to biodiversity as well as part of the climate crisis, is deforestation in many parts of the world, including ecological hotspots like the Amazon basin. And so opposing deforestation when it happens and engaging in our own tree planting to help try to offset that. Trees are very effective little organic machines that absorb carbon dioxide. And so getting more trees into the world in the right places is definitely one of the things we can do to help combat climate change. So there are in sort of a traditional or intrinsic parts of Tu Bishvat that connect to these global issues. So here, these are the four Gilgulim, right? And to my mind, it's up to us to try to forge a synthesis that to integrate. If we integrate these fragmented relationships, we can help heal ourselves and the world, right? Because we have the economic side, we have the spiritual side, we have the national side, and all the ways that we connect, we have the ecological side. And so what we really can do is try to, just like the Kabbalists try to unite the four different worlds that they spoke about, we can try both in our Tu Bishvat observance and in our lives, try to unite, to synthesize these many layers, right? That they can each help and inform and help guide the others, right? Each one of them, when you take them by themselves, they can sort of get out of whack or be out of balance, as Thaler Gordon mentioned, right? Looking at trees and seeing only money, seeing only profits. So the economic, if it's only just economic, can be utilitarian, become utilitarian. The spiritual can be overly spiritualized and abstract. The national, as I mentioned, can turn into narrow chauvinism. So we need to bind these all together. And so I think that if we're thinking about how to celebrate Tu Bishvat, or how to reconstitute our relationship with nature. So we can take both the particular, because we have that very personal fruit-giving tree of the Mishnah, that was a particular thing, and the replanted national trees of Israel, and try to merge that or build the bridges to the universal, which is both the life-giving global trees of the ecosphere in a very real physical ecology, but also the life-giving cosmic tree, right? Eitz Chaim, whether we call it Torah or Kabbalah or whatever. And in the face of, as I've mentioned, deepening environmental crises, it's great that we have, one day where we can really sort of focus on this and think about it or raise awareness. But obviously, like almost everything else we have a day for, we really need to be aware of it and make it an active part of our lives all year round. And so I'm going to conclude and look at that. There'll be even time for questions or comments, which I would very happily entertain, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. But I think that, interestingly, Tu Bishvat, one of what we call a minor holiday, is really can be a model for how to think about renewing Jewish tradition in our day and its engagement with the world, right? If we can create ceremonies and celebrations that reflect our values of particular and universal and justice and spirit and connection to Israel and to the fate of the world, then just think how vibrant Jewish tradition would be. And I see all that in this little holiday of Tu Bishvat. So if it's relevant to wish everyone a good Yor, a Shana Tova for the Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, I want to thank you.
And if any of you have questions, please feel free. If not, I have.
Okay. Or comments.
Comments.
Memories.
Welcome.
Okay, David, it's up to you.
So Rabbi Zev Yavitz was the one who wrote the Toldot Yisrael, the famous Orthodox history book.
I think so.
It's interesting that he's saying there we should plant trees, and he's comparing it to May Day. I've never seen that passage of Yavitz, but he could have easily quoted famous passages in the Talmud, such as the story about Choni Ma'agel,
right,
and the old man in Ta'anit folio 23, or Midrash Tanchuma about the old man and the Emperor Hadrian. It's interesting that he had to look to May Day for an example of planting trees when he could have quoted many midrashim which emphasize the importance of planting trees. So I just found it bizarre. Is that part of a longer passage? Does he really get into it, or it's just a brief suggestion?
I mean, it's part of a longer passage, but I don't think he expands on that. And he may have been thinking maybe how best to present it to his more secular compatriots,
secular
maybe
audience.
look to Europe for ideals rather than to the Talmud.
Uh-huh. And the other thing that struck me when you read the famous passage from Kohelet Rabbah about God in the Garden of Eden is, we grew up on the famous folk song that I know the Pete Seeger version. This land is your land, this land is my land, right?
Right. Sorry, it's Woody Guthrie, yeah.
Right, Woody Guthrie, thank you. And then this land was made for you and me. In other words, what's missing from that song is the theological dimension, right? What Kohelet Rabbah says is, this is my land, don't mess it up, right? But in the Woody Guthrie version, well, it's your land, it's my land, but there's no theological underpinning to that belief.
That's true. That's true. And I personally am inspired by this, what I would call a biblical model of stewardship, which places the human being somewhere in the middle, because we are responsible, say, to the Creator for being entrusted in some level with this. And I have my fights with other environmentalists who don't like to see the human being as so central in global ecology. And I say, we don't have a choice. We are central. We've created all these problems. We're the only ones who can solve them. It's too late to say, let's be humble and somehow merge with the rest, be a plain citizen of the land community. So that we're responsible up, sort of up to the Creator, but also below, down, or around us to our fellow creatures. We have an existential responsibility in that way, and I think that is a very strong message that all the monotheistic traditions can bring to the table, and certainly Judaism.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Benstein. Any further comments or questions? So we will, oh, yes, we have a question from Sandra. You have to unmute yourself. Oh, you cannot? Karen, can you unmute Sandra? Or let her unmute? Karen at Paul?
Okay, now it's okay. So I live in Brazil, so I'm very close to the environment problem here. And
Yeah.
one of the ways I think people begin to realize is to learn from the indigenous people, because
Absolutely.
they know how to live without destroying nature. So I'm thinking if in Israel there is also maybe a path that goes to the ancient people, maybe to learn more, I don't know.
Well, that you raise a really interesting question, but yeah, absolutely, the struggles for indigenous peoples around the world are often very much tied with land and resources and preservation. We see that in North America as well. I would like to make a small claim that we are among the indigenous peoples of this area. We talk about connection to ancient sources that teach us how to live. Well, ideally, we should find them in some of our sources that really grew up in this area thousands of years ago. So I think that those are legitimate sources of wisdom and inspiration as well, without detracting, of course, from the struggles that everyone else is going through.
Yeah, fair. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so we will segue to our last brief lecture of this evening in honor of Tu Bishvat. Our fourth and final lecturer is Dena Thaler, who has been on the TALI curricular staff for many, many years, and for some 10 years, she'll correct me, has been the head of the TALI curricular writing staff. For those of you who don't know, TALI stands for Tigbur Limudei Yahadut. It's an enriched Jewish studies program within the secular public school system in the state of Israel. There are roughly 65,000 children in the TALI school programs in Israel, which are preschools, elementary schools, high schools, and many other programs as well. And one of the wonderful things that TALI has done during the past, especially during the past 20 years, is the staff has produced over 40 different curricular textbooks and games and other units that are used throughout the state of Israel, both by TALI schools and other schools as well. And Dena has been at the forefront of this for many years. And her topic is TALI and Ecology, how we teach sustainability in the TALI school system. Dena, bevakasha.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so I've really enjoyed everyone. Thank you to my fellow lecturers. Just want to start out by saying that I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm sure everyone else has as well. And to say that I'm shocked and surprised that all of a sudden on the screen, my father in New York and my sister joined as well. So what a great treat that is for me to see you.
I was happy to see them also.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we, in honor of Tu Bishvat, how we teach sustainability in our schools and what we do with it. In order, and hopefully that will bring up some of other issues that we deal with in our education. It's just kind of like an example that brings up other issues. So it's kind of a good test case. So in order to talk about how we teach sustainability, I'm going to start with how we teach everything, which is what are the principles that are kind of sitting in back of our heads as we think about how we're going to teach any subject. And there are several principles which are behind everything. We'll start with that it's text-based. Whenever we're teaching, it is always text-based because we very much want our students and teachers, and our education is very much towards teachers and students. We work both with teachers in enrichment programs and with the students directly. We want them to learn about ideas, but not just ideas, but to have them grounded in texts. And we work very much on Jewish literacy so that kids actually feel comfortable with Jewish texts from biblical times till modern Israeli literature. So that's number one. Number two is that we are always values-based. It's not enough we want them to know the sources. We want them to learn values. We want the kids to learn things that are relevant to their daily lives. These things cannot be just abstract. They actually have to have real relevance to their lives. And beyond that, we're not just teaching ideas, intellectual ideas, but we're actually educating towards behavior and action. So sustainability, for sure, we're talking about the ideas. We will talk about the sources where we learn these ideas, but we will always have as our goal, and what are you going to do about this tomorrow? How do these ideas play out in their lives? And finally, we want our materials to be accessible, both to teachers and students. Our teachers are regular Israeli teachers who come from all different backgrounds. Some have some background in Jewish studies, many don't. Many grew up in a secular system where they really did not learn much Jewish sources. And so whenever we bring materials, we have to bring them in a way that teachers will feel comfortable with them, won't feel threatened because they don't know them, and in a way that they'll actually want to bring them to their students. So those are kind of the guiding principles behind everything that we do. And now I'll go over to specifically talking about sustainability. If anyone has questions, bevakasha, stop me along the way, that's totally fine. Okay, so let me see, 1 second.
Dina, would you like me to pull up my thing?
I'll do it, I'll try myself.
Okay, let me know if you want me to.
If I manage. Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Got it. Okay, so teaching sustainability. So the first question is when we teach this. And like everything else that we do, we want to teach it in as many frameworks and times that is possible. So for instance, we'll want to teach it as part of the daily cycle during tefillah. If schools have tefillot, then there are certain tefillot that really lend themselves to talking about our relationship to nature. And brachot, blessings that kind of are obvious. So on a daily basis, if people are in schools, some of TALI schools pray, some don't, some learn about prayer but don't pray, but that's an opportunity that we see every day can be a chance, an opportunity to talk about our relationship to nature. So whether it be a psalm that talks about the beauty of nature, or whether it be one of the birkot hanehenim, the brachot that we say over natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. That's daily. On the weekly cycle, there are many times Parshat HaShavua gives us an opportunity to talk about our relationship to nature. Obvious examples are Parshat Bereshit, creation of the world, and Noach, when actually things kind of got turned around on their heads and were destroyed because of human behavior. These are just two examples of many examples that we can connect educating about nature, our relationship to nature through Parshat HaShavua. On the yearly cycle, Chagim. So there are so many Chagim that have a natural side to them. Obviously, Shloshet HaRegalim, Sukkot, Shavuot, Sukkot, Pesach, each one has its own kind of angle that speaks about our relationship to nature. So on Sukkot, the harvest festival, going out to nature with our Sukkah, Shavuot, we speak about the first fruits, we speak about the Bikurim and the Shivat HaMinim, the 7 species, obviously Tu Bishvat, Pesach, the holiday of spring, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we take it to one last kind of ring, we talk about the 7-year cycle, which is Shemitah, where we are this year, and we also talk about that. So this is, so we try and find as many opportunities to talk about the subject. And then besides that, we have developed several curriculum which are kind of ongoing, not necessarily for one specific time, but are really full, fleshed out curriculum to talk about ecology and kayamut. And what I want to do is give a couple of examples from that, from those programs. So one of the projects that we've developed is called Le'ovda U'Leshamra, which is a quote from Sefer Bereshit. We were told, Adam was told, Le'ovda U'Leshamra, to work the earth and to take care of it. It's kind of a learning center, which includes 21 stations, each station on a different subject, 3 levels of different ages, all in elementary school, but 1st and 2nd grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. And each station using a variety of methods. So we include a lot of games, dilemmas, stories, activities, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of a learning center, and I'll show you now a couple of examples from that learning center. Okay, so in one of the activities, we have the kids all work in small groups. They receive 12 beautiful photographs. I mean, here they're small, but they're bigger. And we created dice, special dice, which have on them different words. So the words in Hebrew, I'll say it in English, are beautiful, good, important, surprising, interesting. There are six sides of the dice, 6 words. And each time the kids throw the dice, and let's say they got the word surprising, they have to find a picture that matches that word and explain why they find that picture surprising, beautiful, interesting, et cetera, important. So it's a way of them talking about looking at nature and what do they see? Because really, in order to talk about ecology, the first stage is really observation, lasim lev. And once we notice things, then we will appreciate it, and we will hakarat hatov, see how good it is. And then the next stage is hakarat todah, be thankful for it. So that's one of the activities in this station. After they do this activity of looking at the pictures, this is an activity for the younger grades. They work on the subject of some of the brachot, some of the blessings about nature. So they are supposed to here match the bracha and the picture. So I'm just going from top to bottom on the picture side, because they have to draw lines kind of crisscrossing. When you see an ocean that a blessing is said, after you haven't seen it for a while, not if you're seeing it every single day. When you see first trees blooming in the month, blossoming in the month of Nisan, when you eat vegetables, when you smell a beautiful fragrance from a plant or from a fruit. So these are just 4 examples of the brachot. We talk about why, what's the point of these brachot, how they can influence you. And then we ask the kids to think about other things in nature that they would like to notice and be grateful about. We also always give the teachers extra ideas what to do beyond. So after this activity, we suggest that they actually go outside, take some dice with them and play outside. So beyond the pictures that we gave them, they actually have to go and find, everyone has to, like, they throw the dice, you found something, the word came out interesting, everyone has to find something that they find interesting in nature and come back and show it and tell, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one example of one of the activities in the Learning Center. I'm going to go and show you the next example. This is something also for the younger students. Actually, we use the same source that you used, Jeremy. So absolutely, this is one of our favorites. The students learn the midrash of God taking Adam around the Garden of Eden. And then what they do is they get, again, working in small groups, they get this big poster, which is a kind of, if you know the game Where's Waldo, right? So it's a poster with lots and lots of details. And there's a pile of cards with the detailed pictures. And each child picks up a card and has to find it where it is in the poster. And it's not so easy, actually. In Hebrew, it's called Efo Efi, whereas Waldo is Efo Efi. So for instance, here I brought two examples of two cards: buying used books, turning off the air conditioner when leaving the room, and the kids have to find the picture in the poster. And then, of course, talk about the midrash and talk about where does this get expressed in their own lives? In what ways? I mean, there are like 25 cards, so 25 activities that they can relate to. And so we ask, what are the activities that you do? Are any of these things that you can do? That there are things here that you should do. There are things that you should do, and there are things that you shouldn't do. That's part of the learning of to divide it up between things you do, things you don't do, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another idea of an activity from this learning center. This is an activity that we do for older students. This is from really 4th grade and up. And we talk about sustainable consumerism from a Jewish perspective. What does Judaism have to say about consumerism? Okay, so what we teach here is we teach 5 ideas that come from the Jewish tradition that can inform our choices when we go to buy something. So for instance, again, kids working in a small group get this luach. In Hebrew, it's called sarchanut b'machshava tchila. It's maybe reminiscent to some of you of from Lecha Dodi. Sof maaseh b'machshava tchila. So it's consumerism with thought out consumerism. So here we bring 5 Jewish ideas, starting from left to right. Tsar ba'alei chayim, don't harm animals. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Lo tachmod, not to covet. V'nishmartem ma'od l'nafshotechem, take care of your health. Lo tashchit, don't waste or destroy nature's resources. So here are 5 Jewish ideas that have something to say about what we buy. The kids get a pile of 20 little cards. Each card has a situation. And they have to decide what Jewish idea this connects to. So for instance, Yotam thinks that water has no taste and so prefers to drink Coke. So what if it's bad for your teeth? So the kids have to decide what Jewish idea is connected to this. So they look at the different options. It's connected to taking care of your health. Okay, and then they move that, they turn it over and move it to put it in its place in the luach. Another example, Ori's family has started buying vegetables straight from the farmers instead of from the supermarket. This way to support the farmers. This, by the way, happened a lot in Israel during Corona times. Really, a lot of people started doing this. But if the kids can see that this is an idea of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that actually informs what they do in terms of how they buy. Not only what they buy, but how they buy. The last example that I brought here is Libby's mom buys cosmetics that have a picture of a rabbit on them. She explained to Libby that this indicates that no animals were used in experiments to produce this product. So again, they have to figure out, where does it belong? It belongs to Tzara Baalei Chayim. They put it on the luach. Each card on the other side has a decoration, like part of a picture, and also some words. So for instance, if they, the Yatam situation was connected to, let's see, where is it connected to? It was connected to the question of health, right? So they would put it there. And if they filled out the luach in the right way, then they get this picture. So they kind of can check if they did it right or not. So that's another example of what we did. I'm going to try and ask a question and see if we can talk, even though I know it's hard with a lot of people, but let's try. So all of these ideas and sustainability in general is a universal idea, right? We're not the only ones teaching this. All teachers in schools are teaching sustainability. It's very in now for good reason, and right? Everyone's teaching it. So why do we have to teach it also? Like, why do we think that it's part of our agenda to teach it also from a Jewish perspective? Why is it important to us to develop materials that teach the same subject that, the science teacher is teaching, the literature teacher is teaching stories about it? Why is it important from our point of view to also bring Jewish sources on this? Any ideas? Karen, I'm going to need you to see if there's anybody answering.
Don't be shy.
I can say maybe that, like you said, it's a very in fashion kind of subject right now, and people are talking about it and people care about it. And I think that connecting it to the Jewish sources make it very relevant to people, because they feel it brings first, I think it brings Judaism kind of back to life. It's not something just far away that talks about things that are not relevant to nowadays. It actually shows that the things that were thought about and were talked about years ago are relevant to our lives, and it's kind of a segue also to other subjects and texts from the Jewish textbooks, but also I think from the other way, it brings a lot of depth into those kind of things, because this international thing could be, wait, how am I connected to it? But when we read all those sources and we do it in such it's an incredible way, Dena. I love those games, and I think it brings it to be more, comes to life, but in a very, very deep kind of way.
Thank you. Thanks, Michal. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Michal was saying. This is not a new topic, okay? So when we can show relevance in Judaism, in, like you said, in the holidays, throughout the year in so many ways, and then you're also talking about that it's throughout the subjects. This is a part of our lives, and it should be part of our lives. If we, as the adults now, want our children to have the resources, we could even discuss how many countries have decided they don't have clean water, or they don't have this, and they've gone through major cleaning up things, and beaches now have been restored, and animals are now getting back habitats. Like I can tell you, in my local community yesterday morning, I'm in South Florida, United States, and they were complaining about this coyote that was walking in the residential neighborhood. Okay. And someone posted, well, be careful with your cats and your dogs and your children. And I'm pointing out, yes, you should be careful, but this coyote is walking in a residential neighborhood because we have built and expanded the residential neighborhoods, and this coyote is displaced. Okay, so
Right.
yes, be safe, but be aware that we are taking over. We have so many animals that are extinct, so many habitats and plants and things, because we're not being cautious individuals.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Anyone else want to relate to the question of why Judaism in this? Why not leave it to the science teacher, to the other teachers?
Well, Dena, I think we had good examples in these different lessons. You and Jeremy quoted from Kohelet Rabbah, which was edited in the land of Israel in the 6th century. Einat quoted from Aleph Dalet Gordon from 100 years ago. I think there's a huge difference between quoting something that was written last Tuesday by a scientist in Pasadena and quoting something from 100 years ago or 1500 years ago. It shows A, that these are universal values, and B, that they are Jewish values. And that most dilemmas, which is why I, of course, enjoy writing Responsa, most dilemmas that we think are not modern. They were simply stated in a different way 100 years ago or 1500 years ago. And by reconnecting to these sources, we're seeing that these are very old problems, which Jews have been discussing for 100 years or 1500 years or 3000 years. And we can learn from our collective wisdom, which is exactly what you're doing in this wonderful game that you're showing us.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I just want to add two more things. Absolutely what everyone has said is correct. It's really, really important for us to show the kids that Judaism has something to say about this too. Because to show that Judaism is relevant and actually can inform our lives, has something very, very relevant to say. It's not something that's, connected to some book, some ancient book that's, not relevant to my life. So it's very, very much important to us to show that Judaism has something to say about these issues. Absolutely. We think it adds a lot of depth, this is not something new. This is something that people have been thinking about for many, many years. The other thing that I just want to add is that it's really important to us to teach the language of Jewish sources. So for instance, the kids might talk about, the example of the farmer, right? Buying the food from the farmer as opposed to from the supermarket, right? And well, we can talk about the idea that, it's really good to help them and to help each other, empathy, et cetera, et cetera. We want them to have the word like on their minds, on their lips. We want them to know the word Bal Tashchit. We want them to have the Jewish language. And that is very much part of why we feel it's important to bring it from a Jewish point of view. I'll just show a couple more examples, unless anyone else wants to ask anything, or I'll show a couple more examples. Okay. Okay, so because it's Shemitah, I thought it was good to bring an example of a game that we prepared for Shemitah. First of all, of course, we teach the source of Shemitah from Shmot. And then there's a card game. There are 28 cards. And as you can see, there are 7 different cards, each one for representing one of the years. So Shana Echad, Shana Shtayim, Shana Shalosh, Shana Arba, all of these are work tools. And the 7th is Shnat Shemitah, and I don't know if you can see it so well, but it's someone resting by a tree. And basically what happens is the kids get 7 cards, not these cards, and they have to get these cards in this order there's all kinds of rules. They can switch, each time they can either switch within the cards within their own cards to make it according to the right order, or they can switch with the player to their right to take a card that they need, basically in order to get this series of 7 years, 6 years of work, and then the 7th year of Shemitah. So, a kind of simple, basic card game, but to talk about the idea of Shemitah. And then after they play and have enjoyed it, we bring sources which talk about what does Shemitah mean to us today. Very much some of the ideas that David, that you brought at the end about our relation to others. And there are different thinkers here, each of whom brought an idea of what Shemitah can mean from a social point of view. Not just agricultural. We've spoken about the agricultural side, and now we're going to talk about the social point of view. So I'll just translate one of the ideas. This is by Harav Moshe Tzvi Neria. Shnat HaShemitah hi shana shel asira v'cheshbon nefesh. The sabbatical year is a year for cheshbon nefesh, for thinking, for stopping and thinking. We're not so busy, farmers are not so busy working, and they have time to actually think about themselves. And obviously, we're not just talking about farmers, but we can all have an opportunity to think about ourselves and about our society. Are there things that we need to change in our society? So that was just this idea, but we bring different thinkers to talk about what Shemitah can mean for us today. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just show one more thing. It's a universal issue, ecology, but it's really important to us to show how it plays itself out in Israel. And we have a game, which is kind of a treasure hunt around the nature reserves in Israel. And the kids learn about the different nature reserves, each one, what is being done in that specific nature reserve, what are the animals there, what are the flora that are there, and they have to kind of work their way around the map about the nature reserves. There are lots more examples, but I'm going to stop here because we're out of time. If anyone has any questions or any comments, I'd be happy to try and answer. Oh, I see that Karen put out a link to Tali's games. Great, terrific.
I wanted to add that if you want to learn more about Tali in general, you can visit the Schechter website, which I wrote in the chat, schechter.edu. There's an entire section there about Tali. If you know Hebrew, you should go to the Tali website, which I wrote also in the chat. And there you can buy many of the books and games produced by the Tali staff during the past 20 years. And especially in recent years, the Tali staff under Dena's direction has produced a lot of games, such as the TALI Ecology kit, which we just glanced at briefly. In summation, do you have any more questions or comments? In summation, we have explored 4 topics this evening, or by some of your times this morning, which deal with different aspects of Tu Bishvat and the Jewish attitude towards nature. I spoke about how Shemitah could or should be observed in the state of Israel today, and Karen wrote the links in the chat for the Hebrew and English responsa. Dr. Einat Ramon spoke about Aleph Dalet Gordon and his attitude towards nature, and she wrote the link, the name of her Hebrew book in the chat, and I hope soon we will see some more texts of Gordon produced by Einat Ramon. Dr. Jeremy Benstein taught us about 4 of the aspects, or the 4 major aspects of Tu Bishvat since the time of the Mishnah 1800 years ago, really the Gilgulim, the reincarnations of this holiday, which has been transformed so many times throughout Jewish history. And I think that is the beauty of Judaism, that it is constantly reinventing itself and transforming itself throughout the centuries. And finally, the lecture about the Tali and sustainability, where, as I said, you can visit the Schechter link or the Tali link to find many more Tali curricular pieces, both textbooks online and games. That is our program for this evening. We wish all of you a very happy Tu Bishvat. And I will give you a promo that zooming into Purim will be on the Sunday night before Purim, which is March 13th. We hope that you will join us. And until then, we wish all of you Tu Bishvat Sameach and much briut, much health, and stay safe. Toda rabah.